This course is part of the Superstar Teachers series. The series is produced by The Teaching Company. This course is titled The Life of the Mind, An Introduction to Psychology. The lecturer for this course is Dr. Richard Gehrig. Dr. Gehrig received his bachelor's degree summa cum laude from Yale University in 1980. He earned his Ph.D. degree in psychology on a Stanford University fellowship and a National Science Foundation predoctoral fellowship. From 1984 to present, he has served as assistant professor of psychology at Yale University. Lecture 1, Interpreting Social Situations.
The first lecture is entitled Interpreting Social Situations. So I'd like to start by giving you a social situation to interpret. This is something that was created in the laboratory by Ross, Amabile, and Steinmetz, but it'll sound familiar from real life because what they were doing was creating a situation very much like a game show. So they brought you into their laboratory, and a lot of the research that I'll be talking about are experiments that have been done primarily on college students. So this is an experiment done at Stanford, so they brought in Stanford students. And they assigned the participants to one of three roles in this little game show. The easiest role was the role of the audience, the observers who sat and watched. The other two participant roles were a contestant role and a questioner role. Essentially the way that works is the questioner gets to ask questions, the contestant tries to answer them. The difference between this and a game show on television, though, is that those two roles, the questioner and contestant, were determined by a flip of a coin. So you came into this experiment as a Stanford undergraduate, the experimenter flipped a coin and designated one person as the person who got to ask the questions, the other one as the contestant. Now the person who was asked to ask the questions was told that he or she should try to find some esoteric little pockets of knowledge and to ask questions based on those little pockets of knowledge. So the specific idea was that the questioner should try to ask things that the contestant can't answer. And then the way the experiment goes is the questioner asks these sorts of questions. Typically the contestant can't answer the questions, and the observers, the audience, sort of titters. So you can imagine already that you'd probably prefer to be in the questioner role than in the contestant role. Once again, remember that this was just determined by a coin flip. So you walked into the lab being sort of equal on these things, and you got turned into one of these two roles. Now what happens at the end of the experiment is that all of these three different sorts of participants, observers, questioners, and contestants, are asked to give ratings of the questioners and the contestants. And the rating scale is this rating scale from 0 to 100, where 50 is an average student, 0 is very much below average, 100 is very much above average. And the question is very simple. Looking at these two people, how much general knowledge do you imagine they have? Are they above or below average, or are they right on average? And so all three different types of participants are asked to say, look at the contestant, look at the questioner, give a rating of the amount of general knowledge this person possesses. And it was emphasized that it wasn't as a function of the scene they had just seen, the situation they had just watched, but in general, how smart do you think these people are? I've given you on the handout the ratings, the actual data from this experiment. If you start by looking at the questioners, what you see is that their ratings were pretty close to 50%. So what you'd expect is that if you look at a large number of recreations of the situation, if you look at a large number of questioners, a large number of contestants, over time, the average rating should be around 50%, because over time you should see sort of the average Stanford student, at least as far as the mean goes. So when you look at the questioners' ratings, in fact, you're looking at 50 and 53%. It looks like the questioners, in fact, over the course of the experiment, on the whole, thought that they were pretty average, and that the people who were trying to answer their questions were also pretty average. The data get a little bit more interesting when you look at the observer data. Now, once again, they think that the contestants were pretty average. So they see this person struggling to answer these questions, and they think, okay, here, these people on the average are right around 50%. But if you look at the rating they give to the questioner, now it's all the way up to 83 on this scale of 0 to 100. So they're suddenly looking at these people and thinking, wow, these guys have a lot of general knowledge. Okay? This should already start to sound a little bit curious. Because the observers were perfectly well aware that there had been this coin flip. They were perfectly well aware that somehow these two people were distributed to these two roles. But the experience they had were sitting in this auditorium, not being able to answer the questions that the questioner was asking. And so they sort of thought, well, this guy knows a lot. I guess he's a pretty smart guy. Okay? And this should already start to strike you as a little bit curious, because they should be able to introspect and understand the way in which, if they were put in that questioner role, that they also would be able to come up with sort of these hard kinds of questions that no one could answer. The data get even a little bit more curious when you look at what responses the contestants gave. So first of all, they also think that the questioners are above average. They give them this rating of 68. So once again, they think, well, here's a guy who knows quite a bit. But the thing that's saddest about this experiment is that they give themselves ratings of 41, below average. So you walk into this psychology experiment feeling like, you're kind of a Stanford undergraduate, you're a pretty bright kind of guy or gal, and about 20 minutes later, as a function of having put in this role of contestant, you suddenly rate your level of general knowledge as below average. This is an experiment in which the coin flip matters quite a bit, because you leave there feeling like you are not quite as bright as the other people in the room. And this is not a good thing, particularly because in this situation, it's totally unwarranted. Once again, what the contestant should be able to do is to understand exactly the way in which things were rigged against him or her, that there's this coin flip, that he or she was put in this position where they were trying to ask questions where the other person was particularly able to use all sorts of little minutiae, and that's not a fair thing. So what this experiment is a wonderful example of a sort of error that people make in the way that they interpret social situations, and the error is prevalent enough so it's come to be called the fundamental attribution error. And what the fundamental attribution error suggests is that people tend to underestimate the impact of situational factors and to overestimate the role of dispositional factors in controlling behavior. So in this game show situation, the people making these ratings of general knowledge are ignoring the situation to a large extent. They aren't thinking about the situation enough to understand that what's happened is this coin flip has created someone in a privileged situation and someone in a non-privileged situation. Instead, what they do is they make dispositional attributions. They explain the way the behavior unfolded in this situation by attributing things to the people rather than to the situation. Now, it turns out that one of the main things you do in your day-to-day life is to figure out why things happened the way they did. So what you're always doing as you're sort of wandering down the street is trying to figure out what behaviors are happening and why they happened, and that's an important thing. Because to the extent that you're going to have control over your life, you have to know why things are taking place. So it's a fundamental activity of your human experience to make these kind of attributions. And what the fundamental attribution error is, or what this suggests, is that there's a fundamental way in which people are biased in the way they make those sorts of attributions. That typically when you are making attributions about behavior, what you're doing is paying more attention to the actor rather than the situation. Now, it's obviously only an error when it's an error, when in fact you should be paying attention to situational sorts of things, because clearly there are a lot of situations in which actors do cause the behavior. However, there are a lot of other situations in which it can be attributed to the situation, and what social psychologists have found in a number of different ways is that the fundamental way in which people err is to make this sort of error. And what I'm going to try to do, I'll be giving you more examples of that as we go through the lecture to try to give you an idea of the way this arises on a day-to-day basis and how you can start to recognize it to start making more accurate attributions about the causes of behavior. Now, there are two levels at which you can analyze the cause of this sort of error. One of those levels is at the level of moment-by-moment interaction. So the basic idea is that you are going through life. You are having this experience of walking down the street or being in a classroom or being anywhere else, and you are trying to, as you go through life, interpret that behavior. You don't always have time to reflect on the situations in which you're embedded. And one large explanation for the fundamental attribution error is going to be as a function of the way you are actually immersed or embedded in everyday life. The other explanation is going to have to do with cultural factors. When we get to it toward the end of the lecture, I will be having some things to say about the way in which we as a culture are more inclined to make this sort of error. But let's begin moment by moment. And what I mean by that is exactly the sort of experience you're having now. You're trying to, even as you listen to me speak, make attributions about my behavior. And typically you are making attributions about my behavior based on me, because that's the fundamental attribution error. The difficulty and the reason that it's so easy to make that sort of error is because what you're doing now is you're looking at me. You're not looking at the situation. You're not spending a lot of time processing information about the situation and what could be causing me to behave in the way I am now. And that's a very general feature of the way that your experience goes. And there are a lot of ways of displaying that experimentally. So a classic social psychology experiment by Jones and Harris back in the 60s. They asked students to come into their laboratory and to write essays for them about Cuba. And the students were assigned either to write an essay for or against Cuba. So what does that mean? So that either the United States essentially should leave Cuba alone or that we should go in there to do something about it. And you were given no choice. You walked into the lab, you were told to do this, so you wrote either a pro-Cuba or an anti-Cuba essay. What happens next, you bring in a new set of subjects and you ask them to read these essays. You explain to them, look, the people wrote these, they were compelled to write the kind of essay they did. They were not given a choice of whether to be anti or pro-Cuba. And then you say to the second group of subjects, but nonetheless, what do you think these people's opinions, what do you think their attitudes toward Cuba really were? And what you find is that the people believe that the individuals who wrote the pro-Cuba essays are pro-Cuba, and the people who wrote the anti-Cuba essays are anti-Cuba. Okay, and you sort of say, no, you don't understand. They were brought in the lab and they were told you have to write these essays. It's sort of like, no, I know that. But you see, I don't think they could have done this task if they really, deep inside themselves, didn't really feel this way. Okay? So even once again, where the situation is very transparent, you find people making the same sort of error. The difficulty, of course, is that you come in as a second group of subjects, and what you're looking at is an essay. You're looking at this thing written by this individual. You're thinking about that individual, and it's difficult at the same time to keep in mind this idea that the people were somehow compelled in that situation. It's hard to keep the situation in mind when what you have in front of you is the evidence of the behavior. The other thing that makes it difficult not to make dispositional attributions is that in a lot of situations, you honestly don't know quite what the situation was that caused the behavior. I will share with you one of the most compelling examples of this from my own life. It's something that happened in a pizza joint near Yale campus. It's a place called Naples. And I went in there one afternoon to get a slice of pizza, and the restaurant was pretty empty, so I decided that I would risk putting some money in the jukebox. I don't know how the rest of you feel about this sort of thing, but I always get very self-conscious when there's one big jukebox and suddenly everyone turns to see who picked the song. So typically I only do it when the restaurant is pretty empty. And it was, in fact, pretty empty until I dropped in my quarter, and then suddenly swarms of students were gathering around while I picked my song. And so I was getting rather nervous. So I picked about the two blandest things I could possibly think of, and the first one came on, and people kind of looked up and looked a little dismayed, but so far my reputation was intact. And then the next song that came on was this perfectly ridiculous Christmas song. I've never heard it before. I will never hear it again. I don't believe it's ever been played more than once in any location in all of America. And I never finished my slice of pizza. I was just right out the door because it was clear that everyone was looking at me and staring in horror because they believed that I had chosen this song. And what I really wanted to do was turn around and yell as I was exiting, "No, you've made the fundamental attribution error." Because, in fact, that's exactly what had happened. There's still people who point and laugh as I walk around campus. It was a very ghastly song. The point there is that, in fact, I was absolutely right. They had made the fundamental attribution error. They had assumed that I had chosen this song. There's something about me that had caused me to want to hear the song, whereas I knew fully well that it was something about the situation, that this jukebox was the jukebox from the Twilight Zone or something, and had decided to try its little experiment on me for once. So the point of this is that you ought to be able to find other circumstances that will sound similar in your own lives. In fact, almost certainly 10 or 12 times today, where you realize that people are making mistakes about the way in which they're interpreting your behavior. The difficulty is all they can see is what you're doing, and they don't have all of the other information that surrounds it to sort of give them the leg up on understanding it. And this is why we spend a lot of time explaining to people what the situation was like, what it was that really happened that caused us to emit a certain kind of behavior. The last and related problem are circumstances in which, in fact, the reason you're behaving in a certain way is because something didn't happen. So you could imagine, for example, that the reason I rushed from the restaurant embarrassed is because the song I intended to play was Frank Sinatra's My Way, which until recently was on the jukebox. And I was so upset because it hadn't been on there, that it hadn't played, that I had left the restaurant in disgust. Again, in that situation, you probably would have said, well, here's someone who gets disgusted and rushes out of restaurants and something about me, whereas, in fact, what I would be reacting to, the reason that my behavior would come out in this way, was because something didn't happen. And again, it's hard to see that. So what I'm trying to suggest to you, and I hope this will sound pretty reasonable, is that one of the chief reasons that people make these kind of errors in attribution is because, to a certain extent, it's hard to see situations. What you're seeing is people in front of you. Now, the problem is that it makes a difference. There are a lot of circumstances in which, in fact, the fundamental attribution error is an error, where it can lead to some unfortunate circumstances. I've already given you a major hint at that by suggesting that in this first game show experiment, you would be very unhappy to be a contestant. You would not be delighted at all to walk into the laboratory, go through this short experiment, and 20 minutes later feel as if you were kind of an unknowledgeable person. So what we do in these sorts of experiments typically is we sit people down and we explain to them what effect the experiment has had on them. It's called debriefing. You try to explain to people why they ought not feel bad about themselves as a function of having been in this experiment. Okay. The difficulty, even with that, though, is that people turn out to be very clever at making their attributions stick. So once people have sort of analyzed the situation and come to some kind of understanding about what happened, they tend to be pretty good at perpetuating that interpretation. And the thing that makes it particularly interesting is that this happens even in situations when it's their own behavior. So even when you yourself are the contestant and you're made to understand that the situation that made you feel unknowledgeable, there is a large possibility that you will still feel as if you're unknowledgeable. And let me describe to you an experiment that showed exactly that sort of effect. This is another experiment run by Mark Lepper and Lee Ross. What they did is they first brought you into the laboratory and they told you that what you were going to be doing was to try to separate fake and real suicide notes. So they give you a pile of notes and they ask you to put them into these two categories, either fake or real. They allow you to do this for a short amount of time. They come back in, they look to see what you've done, and then there are two conditions. In one condition, you're made to feel like a great success. So essentially that's what they say to you. Wow, you're really good at this. Have you done this before? No, well, that's amazing. You're really good at this. Okay? Turns out this is the cell of the experiment that people are pretty happy to be in. There is another cell of the experiment, which is the failure cell, where they kind of look at the two piles and go, wow, this is not so good. Do you have any friends? Okay, what happens next is they leave and they let you stew for a little while. And then they come back, maybe about 10 minutes later, and they say to you in either the success or the failure condition, look, this was just a psychology experiment. We just made that up. It was random feedback, which in fact it was. Subjects were randomized. The success or failure feedback bore no resemblance to the real performance. But they told the subjects that. And then they asked them this very simple question. Okay, given now that we've told you that feedback we gave you bears no resemblance whatsoever to anything about real life, how do you think you would have done if we'd just asked you really to do this task and if we'd given you honest feedback? And as you'd imagine by now, the answers are the people in the success condition over here say, I would have been great at it. The people in the failure condition say, nope, I would have been bad at it still. The question is why? So I've now given you perfect information about that you should make a situational attribution. I've told you, look, I made up this response. It bears no resemblance to real performance, and yet people now still make these attributions, dispositional attributions to themselves. I would have been great, I would have been terrible, depending on which feedback they were given, even though they know it's totally random. So the question is why? And there are at least a couple of explanations you can give. The first of which is that, it's down here as bias, search, recollection, and assimilation of information. Well, what's going to happen for those 10 minutes when I leave you to stew? Let's talk about the success condition, because it's a nicer condition to talk about. Well, I just told you that you're good at this task. So what are you going to do? Well, you're going to feel good about yourself. And we know, for example, psychologists know that when you're feeling good, you tend to call up other memories that also were about successful sorts of things. So you would also call up memories where, in the other circumstances in which you've succeeded. And this is the sort of thing that people do. Now, what happens is when I come back into the experimenter and tell you, it was just random feedback, you didn't really succeed in this situation, you say, fine, but you now have thought about all the other times in which you've succeeded, and you say, well, even so, I would have done well here, because I've done it well a lot of other times in the past. Meanwhile, the guy in the failure condition has now thought about everything bad that's ever happened in his life, and it's the same sort of thing. Poor guy. Again, the other sort of explanation is the formation of causal explanations. Well, again, I've just told you you've done very well. Well, what's the next thing you're going to do? Well, as a regular part of your human experience, you make causal attributions. You try to figure out why the things that have happened. And so what you're trying to do now is to come up with a reason why you would have been good at this task. And so you sit there and you think of, well, why would I be good at sorting suicide notes? And you think about all the times when people told you you're a good friend and how you're a very good listener and people like to eat at your table at dinner. When you go to a restaurant, the people at the tables nearby crane in to listen to what you have to say. You're feeling really good. I ask you, how do you think you would have done? You've got this causal explanation in place, and you're feeling good still. The guy over here, all he can remember is the time he killed his goldfish. And so he's thinking about all these, again, creating this causal explanation. So I've given you this, I've told you this bit of behavior, you're not good at this task, what you're trying to do is make attributions. Again, in the failure condition, you make them to yourself. You come up with some causal explanation. By the time I've taken out this piece of information, I told you, look, it was random, it doesn't matter. You've already got this causal explanation in place, and so when I say to you, how do you think you would have done? You still tell me you wouldn't have done well at all. Okay. So the point of dwelling on this idea that you're experiencing life moment by moment is that the way that you do that, this sort of focusing on actors rather than situations, is going to cause you to make this error. But the sense in which it's sort of critical to understand what the error is and why it arises is because people make it at their own expense. People change their own impressions of what they are like and where their skills are at their own expense as a function of making this sort of error. Okay. Now, it turns out that I've only given you part of the story so far, which is what it's like to be embedded on a day-to-day basis in the interpretation of experience. It turns out that the other level of analysis that you can take is the level of culture. Because it turns out that there's something peculiarly Western about being so focused on dispositions and not situations. So it turns out that to think about situations, as I've just explained, because on a moment-by-moment basis, you see actors, to think about situation takes some effort, and it turns out that there are cultures in which they take a little bit more effort. So one of my colleagues at Yale, a woman named Joan Miller, has done some research in non-Western cultures on exactly this topic. She has compared the way in which American adults and children and Indian adults and children, so Asian Indian adults and children, explain the sorts of things, explain what happens to people. So the first thing she did was to go to these two cultures and ask people to tell stories about the sorts of things that had happened in their life. So you might get a story something like this. This concerns a motorcycle accident. So this was something given by an adult in India. The back wheel burst on the motorcycle. The passenger sitting in the rear jumped. The moment the passenger fell, he struck his head on the pavement. The driver of the motorcycle, who was an attorney, as he was on his way to court for some work, just took the passenger to a local hospital and went on and attended to his court work. I personally feel the motorcycle driver did a wrong thing. The driver left the passenger there without consulting the doctor concerning the seriousness of the injury, the gravity of the situation, whether the passenger should be shifted immediately, and he went on to the court. So ultimately, the passenger died. Now, your task in this experiment is to think about that event and give an explanation for it. So, as an interviewer, I would ask you to read this story, and then I would say to you, why did the driver leave the passenger at the hospital without staying to consult about the seriousness of the passenger's injury? And I would ask you to answer that question. And what you find are very different pattern of responses for the Indians and the Americans as adults. So, for example, a typical response from a Hindu adult subject was something like this. It was the driver's duty to be in court for the client whom he's representing. Secondly, the driver might have gotten nervous and confused. And thirdly, the passenger might not have looked as serious as he was. These are all things about the situation. These are all situational attributions. The driver had to be in court, couldn't stay there, maybe he didn't understand the situation, he's nervous and confused. This is sort of a momentary thing. It's not something deep inside of him. Here, by contrast, is an explanation by an adult American subject. The driver is obviously irresponsible. The driver was in a state of shock. The driver is aggressive in pursuing his career success. This is very different. Okay? And in fact, what you find is that it is consistently different. If you sort of categorize the sorts of explanations that adults in these two societies give, they are very different for the American adults than for the Hindu adults. The American adults disproportionately make attributions to the dispositions of the people involved rather than to the situations. Now, again, it's going to be true in some cases that that's an appropriate disposition. I don't want to give you the idea at all that situations always determine behavior. There are things about people that cause them to behave a certain way. What these data suggest is that there's a cultural difference at the same time that makes it more likely that American adults are going to make this sort of error. The reason I keep saying adults over and over again is because if you do this exact same experiment with kids at about age 8, you don't get these differences. 8-year-olds in both American culture and Hindu culture give about the same sorts of explanations, which are largely situational explanations. It's only the American adults that look very different. The American adults are making these kind of dispositional attributions, and that's an interesting thing to know. It's particularly interesting because it is often the case that in American culture, we browbeat ourselves about what we as Americans are like as a culture. There are many circumstances in which newspaper pundits write essays, write op-ed pieces about the change in the way that Americans behave as individual behaviors, and that there's something in the change of the culture. And it turns out that in a lot of circumstances, that's not at all the right analysis. What you should be focusing on is the way that situations change rather than the way people change. Perhaps the most famous example of this still comes from something that happened in 1964 in New York City. A woman named Kitty Genovese was murdered in front of 38 of her neighbors. This was quite a famous event at the time because this was a remarkable thing, even for New York City, to have this woman murdered over an extended period of time with many, many of her neighbors watching. So they counted that 38 people watched this murder take place. And what happened is that there was sort of this spasm of sort of snotty soul-searching in the press about people talking about the breakdown of American culture, that Americans were all becoming apathetic, what was wrong with the things inside of Americans. And what happened instead, or what happened in response, is that social psychologists sort of looked at what had happened and were fairly convinced that there wasn't anything wrong with the people. What was wrong was that the situation was such a powerful one. And what they came to do was to run a large number of experiments to show exactly how powerful this situation of bystander intervention is. And what they were able to do was to identify some of the factors in the situation that made it almost impossible for Kitty Genovese's neighbors to help her, even though she was clearly in need of help. Let me describe to you one sort of experiment that was meant to show what the factors were, and then I'll tell you a little bit about the factors. This was an experiment that was conducted at Columbia University in New York City by Latney and Darley. And what they did is they brought their subjects into the laboratory, and the cover story was that they were going to be filling out a questionnaire that was about life at a college in an urban setting. So what happens is they come down and sit down in the room. In one situation, they're alone. In the other situations, there are other people in the room with them. I'll get to that in a moment. What starts to happen is as they sit down to start filling out this questionnaire, the room begins to fill with smoke. And so by the end of 6 minutes, the room is so filled with smoke that their vision is obscured. They can't see anything. Okay? And the question is, under these circumstances, what percentage of the people get up and let someone know that something has gone wrong? Now, it turns out that if you're in the room alone, if you sat down to fill out this questionnaire and you're in the room alone, 75% of the time you'll get up to let someone know that the room is filling with smoke. Okay, so it's still not clear what the other 25% of the people are doing, but at least 75% of the time you're getting up and you're saying, I'm sorry, we have a problem in here. Okay? If you now get to a situation where there are 3 people in that room, so these are 3 random Columbia students who have come into that room, they've sat down, the percentage drops already to 38%. So again, it's the same situation. You're sitting there, the room is filling with smoke. The only difference is that there are 2 other individuals in the room. The percentage falls from 75 to 38. In a third condition, the 2 other individuals were 2 confederates of the experimenter who were told, sit there and don't do anything no matter what happens. And in fact, in that situation, when you are the only real subject and these 2 other people are just going to sit there like lumps, no matter how smoky the room gets, only in 10% of the cases do people get up and tell the experimenter something's going on. So in that situation, 90% of the time, you're sitting in a room full of smoke and you're just sitting there, yeah, I guess there's a little street crime. And this is a remarkable thing. In fact, you might wonder, when you ask these people, what did you think was going on? You actually get some really remarkable answers. Some of the people suggest that it was truth gas. So here they are in a psychology experiment. They're pumping in truth gas. The other one is that the other explanation that people give is because they are filling out a questionnaire on life at an urban university, that they thought the experimenter was trying to simulate smog so they would feel right at home. Okay? Now, this is a very powerful difference. To go from 75% to 38% to 10% is a powerful thing. And in some respects, it's obviously a much milder version of a woman on the street being murdered, but it captures a lot of the same features, and that's the important thing. So the question is, why aren't people getting up to let them know something's going on? And Latney and Darley and their colleagues ran a large number of experiments that had a variety of different sorts of emergency situations when, in fact, things getting closer and closer to the actual Genovese sort of thing. Okay? What they identified was 3 kinds of factors that seem to be determining non-intervention in this sort of situation. The first of which is diffusion of responsibility. So you have this belief that, say in the situation with Kitty Genovese, that you know that other people are watching, that one of them would have done something. So you're in a state of what's called pluralistic ignorance. You believe that there are so many other people watching that someone else would do something. So that's diffusion of responsibility. The second thing that happens is defining the situation through assessment of social cues. No one ever wants to embarrass themselves. So if you are in a room with other people, you don't want to be the first one to jump up and say, oh my God, fire, because you don't want them to titter when you've overreacted. So one of the most important ways in which we decide how to behave in a situation is to kind of look around and see how other people are interpreting the situation. And most situations are ambiguous. That's why there's room for a fundamental attribution error, because there's room to interpret behavior in more than one way. And in particular, a lot of situations, it either could be an emergency or it couldn't be. So in some of the experiments that Darlene Latounet did, they had people on New York subway trains who either were passed out or were dead, and you couldn't tell which. And so you had to rely on the way in which other people interpreted their behavior to see what was going on. So you count on other people to help you to come to an understanding of a situation. And thirdly, social modeling of behavior. This is sort of relates, well, it's very much like the other two, in the sense that you, in fact, will start to help if you see other people helping. That's what's meant by social modeling of behavior. The difficulty, once again, is that if no one starts, then no one starts. You sit around with a lot of people thinking, something ought to happen here, but I guess no one else is doing anything, so I guess I don't want to be the person either. So when you go back to the experimental situation, that's how you explain this difference between 75% and 38% or 10%. When you're alone in a room, there's no one else to help you interpret the situation. There's no one to sort of sit there and be the person you could think, well, if it was really an emergency, this guy would do something, or if it was really an emergency, he would have done something already, or however that's going to go. And that's how you can explain this fall-off in behavior. And that's how you can explain a lot of real-life events where it's a situation in which help is needed, but no one gives help because they don't know. It turns out that this goes a long way toward explaining that kind of event. And so it was not an appropriate sort of thing for people to write these sort of negative reviews of the American spirit. Instead, what had to happen is for psychologists to give some more insights into what about the situation was bringing that about. There's a very strong piece of advice that I can give you here, too. If you now ever find yourself in an emergency situation, you should know what to do. If you have in your head that people are going to treat a situation like this, the thing to do is to specifically try to overcome each of these factors by pointing to someone and saying, you, help me. Yes, you, I need your help. This is an emergency. Don't be pluralistically ignorant. Come and give me a hand here, okay? And this might seem right up there with sort of turning at the door of a restaurant and saying, you're all committing the fundamental attribution error and stalking out. But in fact, in a real emergency situation, given that these factors are working so strongly to keep people from interpreting it as a situation in which they ought to help, it is incumbent upon you to make them help. What I'd like to turn to for the last part of the lecture is now, I hope, having firmly established in your minds the reasons that we make this kind of error, is to give you a much more of a sense, or a little bit more of a sense, of why attributions are important at all. Okay, so I've said to you they're important because you do them all the time. The question is, what value are they of? Why not just give up making attributions all together? And I've already said something about that, which is that you kind of need to be able to explain behavior to kind of figure out what the rest of your life is going to be like. It's also the case that having made an attribution, we are tremendously good at making it stick. And this can be a problem, too, because if you're making the fundamental attribution error, if once again you're making these sort of mistakes, and you get to be pretty good at making them stick, then that can have negative consequences for the way you sort of make your way through life. Now let me describe to you an experiment that I hope will give you a sense of what I'm getting after here. It's an experiment that was conducted by Snyder and Swan, and they were interested in studying something that they call self-fulfilling prophecies. And they're called self-fulfilling prophecies because the idea is that you have in mind something, you've made a prediction about how someone's going to behave, you've made an attribution, and you can actively influence your environment to make it come about. So far I have been talking about as if what you're doing when you make attributions is you're sitting with your check pad sort of saying, okay, it's the disposition, and sort of just watching things go by. In fact, in most cases, you are actively involved in the situation, and so you have it in your power to actively change the course of what's going to happen. So to the extent that you're making one sort of attribution rather than another, that can affect the way that behaviors will play out in a way to make, in fact, the behaviors conform to the kind of explanations you were giving. So the point is that there's a circularity here, that once you've made up your mind about the way something ought to happen, you can, in fact, make it work out that way. Let me explain to you how you can get that sort of effect in the laboratory. Again, you start by bringing in some subjects. In this case, what you do is you tell them, look, imagine you were going to interact with another individual, and let us tell you something about this other individual. So in some cases, they told their subjects that the other individual was going to be an extrovert, which is someone who's typically outgoing, sociable, energetic, confident, talkative, enthusiastic. Okay. And the other situation, they told their subjects to imagine that they were about to interact with someone who was an introvert, so someone who's typically shy, timid, reserved, quiet, distant, and retiring. So already, if I've told you about one of those two people, you have in your mind a model of two very different sorts of individuals, either this extrovert who's very gregarious or this sort of shy introvert. The next thing I ask you to do is to read over a list of questions, and I've given some of them to you here. Things like, what would you do if you wanted to liven things up at a party? In what situations do you wish you could be more outgoing? What factors make it hard for you to really open up to people? In what situations are you most talkative? Now imagine I was going to ask you to go through this exercise of picking some of these questions to ask the individual you expect to meet, so either an introvert or an extrovert. If you look through these questions, you'll see that there are some of these questions you're much more likely to choose if you think you're going to talk to an extrovert, and there are others that are more likely if you think you're going to talk to an introvert. So for instance, if you think that you're about to talk to someone who's shy, you're very unlikely to ask them, what would you do if you wanted to liven things up at a party? Because they're likely to say, I'd stay home. Okay? Whereas if you think you're about to talk to an extrovert, you're unlikely to ask them what factors make it hard for you to really open up to people. Okay? Because you don't expect an extrovert to have that sort of problem. So if you imagine going through this exercise, in fact, what happens in their experiment is that people pick the questions to ask that are likely to confirm their bias. So if you tell them you're about to talk to an introvert, they pick the questions that make it likely that if they were to talk to this person would give them information that would make him or her seem introverted. So in fact, if you were to ask me in what situations are you most talkative, I can tell you situations in which I'm most talkative, irrespective of whether I'm an introvert or an extrovert. If you ask me in what situations do you wish I could be more outgoing, whether I am an introvert or an extrovert, once again, I can give you that information. The point is that as a function of asking a particular sort of question, you're going to get the kind of information that's consistent with your hypotheses. And you should be able to search your memories for the sorts of situations in your own lives where, in fact, you go in with this kind of idea and ask questions that are consistent with your hypothesis. Now, in the Snyder and Swan experiment, they just asked people to go through this exercise of looking at the questions and asking which ones they might select. Later experiments have actually let people interact to see what happens. One of my favorites is an experiment by Curtis and Miller, which was carried out a couple of years ago. What they did was to bring pairs of same-sex individuals, both men or both women, into their laboratory. And they let them interact for a little bit. These were people who already knew each other a little bit. They let them interact for a while. And in this experiment, there were two roles. One of the people was designated as a target, and one of the people as a perceiver. These roles were actually assigned after this first period of interaction. So you've talked for a little bit. I now bring you to separate rooms. I ask you to fill out some little psychology measurement devices, a couple of questionnaires. And then a couple of minutes later, I come back into the room as the experimenter. If you're the perceiver, I don't tell you anything at all, because what's meant by the perceiver as the person who essentially is neutral and is going to perceive the behavior of the target, which is why the person's called the target. The target, on the other hand, is given a bias. In particular, he or she is told, I just came from this other guy's room, and I'm looking at his responses to the questionnaire, and, he doesn't like you very well. I don't know why that is. Or in the he likes you condition, and again, it's nicer to be in that condition, you say to the person, hey, I just looked at this guy's responses, and he thinks you're a pretty good guy. And now I get you back together. I put you in a situation. I'll let you talk some more. Okay? So again, the perceiver is coming back totally neutral. He or she has no idea that this other guy has a bias. And the question is, what happens next? Well, you can see the endpoint by looking at the data that I've given you here. This rating scale, 7 means, a score of 7 would mean that I really like this guy a lot or that I really think he likes me a lot. And what you can see is if you look down to the liked column and the disliked column, that when people have been given, when the target has been given this bias of, oh, this guy likes me, at the end of the time that they're allowed to talk, in fact, everyone likes each other better. Each of the two participants, the target and the perceiver, says, I like this guy, he likes me, she likes me. If you looked at the other column, the dislike, in fact, they're much smaller numbers. The perceiver doesn't like the target doesn't like the perceiver. Everyone is just so happy to be out of there. Okay? Now, again, you can understand why this would work for the target, because he or she has walked in there and he thinks, this person doesn't like me, or this person likes me, so you'd understand that. What's interesting here is how swiftly the target is able to bring about congruency in the attitudes of the perceiver. And you can put yourself in that situation. You can imagine what it would be like to walk back into a room with someone you've just been told doesn't like you at all. you might be a little hostile. If they ask you a question, you might respond to it in kind of a dislikable way. And in fact, people are very, very good at bringing about these changes. That's what the data show. Okay? So it's not particularly surprising because you can all imagine being in that situation. It's only probably disconcerting if you imagine what it was like to be the perceiver. So you come back in, and again, if you're the perceiver, when the guy's been told that he likes you, you don't feel so bad. But if you're the guy's in the dislike condition, you walk in, and suddenly this person is being harsh at you. And what you're trying to do is sort of figure out why that would be, because you're totally neutral. But over time, you sort of give up and say, fine. He doesn't like me, I won't like him either. Fine, okay? Once again, these are people who knew each other already. So you can imagine what happens when they leave the experiment. Okay, the other thing that happens, they're thoroughly debriefed. They understand that it was totally the situation that brought it about. The other thing that's just worth noticing in these data, just quickly, is that in every case, the people, the raters think that they like the other person better than the person likes them. Okay, so if you look at the ratings, how much you believe the other person likes you, they're always lower than how much you like the other, and that's just sort of interesting thing to think about a little bit too. Okay, the question is, what's happening here? What's bringing about these self-fulfilling prophecies? So again, the question is, how are people behaving in such a fashion that they're going to make these self-fulfilling prophecies come true? And there are two kinds of explanation. First of all, people test hypotheses by preferentially searching for behavioral evidence that will confirm them. So this should sound familiar. The basic idea is that when I have a hypothesis, the kind of evidence that I'm trying to get from you is to confirm my hypothesis. So if I think you're going to be an introvert, if I think you're going to be shy, I ask you questions that will enable you to display your shyness to me. If I think you're going to be not liking me, I sort of act toward you in a way that's going to enable you to display the fact that you don't like me very well. Okay? Secondly, these search procedures alter real social interaction so that confirmation is found for the hypotheses. So once again, this is the sense in which all of this matters. Attributions matter. The kinds of hypotheses that you bring to this sort of situation, in fact, are going to change the way in which you act toward other people. Okay. Now, after all of this, you might be wondering if there's any hope whatsoever. If you are the perceiver in this situation, if the person with whom you are interacting has some sort of bias toward you, is there anything you can do about it? And the answer turns out to be sure. In another sort of experiment, this is now some research by Swan and Ely, what you find is that if the people in the perceiver situation, if the people about whom the bias has been given, in fact, have very great confidence in what they're really like, that they can, in fact, over time, over the course of an interaction, change the target person, or change, in this case, the person with the bias, impression of them. So if you come into a room believing that I am introverted, and I firmly believe that I'm extroverted, if we interact long enough over time, we're going to find that there is a mismatch. And if I'm confident enough, I'm going to be able to convince you of that mismatch. Which suggests in some very fundamental way that Mom was always right. You should give people a second chance, because if you give them that second chance, if you give them this opportunity to interact for an extended period of time, it's more likely that you're going to get to the truth of the situation. So if you believe that there's this possibility of having made a fundamental attribution error, the point here is that you ought to give a person an opportunity to see them in another situation to see if they behave similarly. So just by way of summary, once again, what you're doing in most situations of behavior is you're trying to figure out why things happened. You're making attributions. So it has been of great interest to people in psychology to understand the ways in which people make those attributions and why they're important. What I've suggested to you is that there is, in fact, this bias toward making dispositional attributions rather than situational attributions, for making conclusions about something inside a person rather than something about the situation or the culture. And so it's an important thing to think a little bit more about that, to see the ways in which you can, in fact, be a little bit more accurate about how you're interpreting behavior by keeping in mind that there's this basic tendency.